episodes.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program, and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of CIUT-FM.
From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Hopefully this Friday is the Friday of the greatest truant, a Friday of victory for our Muslim brothers. This is a blessed Friday.
In Syria, tens of thousands crowd the Great Mosque of Damascus to attend the first Friday prayer since rebels toppled longtime authoritarian President Bashar al-Assad last Sunday. We'll go to Damascus to speak with Middle East Associated Press reporter Sarah Al-Deeb. Then today is the 75th day of a hunger strike by Leila Sway, the mother of the prominent British-Egyptian political prisoner Alaa Abdel Fattah. She's calling on British officials to pressure Egypt for the release of her son. We'll speak to the Cairo University mathematics professor in London, where she's been standing outside the Foreign Office.
I'm definitely angry, really angry from the way things are happening, and of course angry about him continuing to be imprisoned. He wasn't supposed to be in jail for 5 years, let alone the 5 years before in his first jail term.
Then to Amali Yeshitela, longtime chair of the African People's Socialist Party and leader of the Uhuru movement. He's due to be sentenced to prison Monday after a Florida jury found him and two others known as the Uhuru Three guilty of conspiring to act as Russian agents, but cleared them of actually doing so.
A jury determined that we were not Russian agents, and which meant, of course, that they agreed that the only thing we'd ever done is work for the liberation of African people, on the one hand. On the other hand, they convicted us of conspiracy to do something that never happened.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Syria, tens of thousands of people have gathered at the Great Mosque of Damascus and other cities across the country for the first Friday prayers since longtime authoritarian President Bashar al-Assad was toppled by opposition fighters. The World Food Programme is appealing to donors to help it scale up relief operations for some 2.8 million displaced and food-insecure Syrians. That includes more than 1.1 million people uprooted by fighting since late November. Israel's defense ministers told his troops to prepare to spend the winter holding the demilitarized zone that separates Syria from the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu toured the summit of Mount Haramun in the UN-designated buffer zone. Netanyahu said this week the Golan Heights would, quote, forever be an inseparable part of the state of Israel, unquote. On Thursday, the UN called for an urgent de-escalation of airstrikes on Syria by Israeli forces and their withdrawal from the UN buffer zone.
Yep.
The Secretary General is deeply concerned by the recent and extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Secretary General is particularly concerned over the hundreds of Israeli airstrikes on several locations in Syria, stressing the urgent need to de-escalate violence on all fronts throughout the country.
In Ankara, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Turkey's foreign minister and the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Blinken said the U.S. and Turkey would work to prevent a resurgence of the Islamic State in Syria. Meanwhile, Erdogan told Blinken Turkey reserves the right to strike the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces led by the Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, which Turkey considers a terrorist organization. After headlines will go to Damascus for the latest on Syria.
Terrorist organization.
in Gaza. An Israeli airstrike on Thursday ripped through a post office sheltering displaced Palestinian families in the Nuseirat refugee camp, killing at least 33 Palestinians, with 84 others wounded or missing. Elsewhere, separate Israeli strikes killed at least 13 people in Rafah and Khan Yunis. Palestinian medics said those killed were part of a force protecting humanitarian aid trucks. This comes as a new study finds 96% of children in Gaza feel their death is imminent, and nearly half said they wish to die. 4 out of 5 children surveyed suffer from nightmares. Nearly 3/4 show signs of aggression. The study was conducted by the charity War Child Alliance, which said in a statement, quote, alongside the leveling of hospitals, schools, and homes, a trail of psychological destruction has caused wounds unseen, but no less destructive on children who hold no responsibility for this war, unquote. Meanwhile, Reporters Without Borders warns Palestine remained the most dangerous country in the world for journalists this year. Since October 2023, Israeli attacks have killed more than 145 media workers, which the group condemned as an unprecedented bloodbath, unquote. Palestinian press freedom groups have put the number even higher at nearly 200 journalists killed by Israel. Russia's launched a massive missile and drone attack targeting Ukraine's energy grid, sending Kyiv residents underground to seek shelter in the city's metros. This is a mother and daughter who were displaced from Kherson due to the war.
Of course, I would rather be going to work and have my child go to school now. But as you can see yourself, a raid alert is issued, and we had to go to the shelter to hide from the missiles. It is very difficult, of course. Every night there is an air alarm. My child is always scared.
On Thursday, Moscow reissued its threat to retaliate against a Ukrainian attack on a southwestern Russian city, which it says involved U.S.-made ATACMS ballistic missiles. Meanwhile, the U.S. says Russia could soon launch another strike using an intermediate-range hypersonic missile that was deployed for the first time last month. In South Korea, a second motion to impeach President Yoon Suk-yeol was submitted to the parliament today over Yoon's declaration of martial law on December 3rd. Yoon was forced to reverse the order just 6 hours later amidst widespread outrage and protest. An earlier impeachment motion failed to remove Yoon after much of his ruling People Power Party boycotted the vote. Street protests demanding his removal are continuing. French President Emmanuel Macron has appointed centrist ally François Bayrou as prime minister, following the collapse of the previous government in a no-confidence vote. In choosing Bayrou, Macron once again eschewed widespread calls for him to select a progressive prime minister after a leftist coalition won the largest share of votes in July's snap parliamentary elections. At The Hague, the International Court of Justice has heard more testimony and arguments this week on how the unfolding climate catastrophe is creating an existential crisis for low-lying Pacific Island nations. Those countries are demanding wealthy, polluting nations be held legally responsible for addressing the crisis they created. This is Langene Ikalele Talia, the Attorney General of Tuvalu, which could soon become the first country to be wiped from the face of the earth due to sea level rise.
Tuvalu may soon become uninhabitable. In these circumstances, there can be no question that our fundamental right to self-determination is being violated. And in these proceedings, there is unsurprisingly considerable consensus across participants that climate change is impeding the right to self-determination.
Today is the last day of hearings at the World Court, which is expected to publish its final advisory opinion on the matter in the new year. In Washington, D.C., police arrested 13 people on Thursday as they non-violently blockaded the headquarters of the Department of Energy, demanding the Biden administration cancel authorizations for new liquefied natural gas export terminals. Activists say greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed exports would be equivalent to 1,000 coal-fired power plants.
I'm a mom and a teacher, and I feel like I owe it to my daughter and my students. I gotta be able to sleep at night to go to work and teach them, and I can't sleep at night if I don't do everything in my power to stop what's currently happening.
A new investigation by the Marshall Project finds hospitals across the U.S. are dispensing medications to patients in labor only to report them to child welfare authorities when they or their newborns test positive for those very same substances on drug tests. Federal law requires hospitals report positive drug tests to ensure babies who need it can receive treatment for withdrawal. But amidst the increased criminalization of reproductive health care, health experts say hospitals need to put into place more patient safeguards around drug testing. Hospital reports based on the misleading drug tests have led to investigations and even the removal of children from their parents. Luigi Mangione, the suspect in the shooting death of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in New York, is fighting his extradition from Pennsylvania, where he was arrested by authorities Monday. Mangione's lawyer says they're waiting for more evidence related to the charges against him in New York. Meanwhile, the NYPD warned healthcare executives earlier this week after a hit list of CEOs was posted online. Wanted posters popped up across New York this week featuring photos of health insurance CEOs as the case has galvanized public condemnation of the health insurance industry. In related news, a woman in Florida was arrested and charged this week for threatening to conduct a mass shooting or an act of terrorism after she ended a call to her insurance company Blue Cross Blue Shield with the words delay, deny, depose. Those three words were found written on bullet casings at the scene of Brian Thompson's shooting. Delay, deny, and defend are known as the 3 Ds of the health insurance industry. Here in New York, immigrant justice activists rallied outside City Hall to protest Mayor Eric Adams' meeting with Trump's incoming border czar Tom Homan, who's vowed to enact Trump's plans for mass deportations. This is Jennifer Hernandez of Make the Road New York.
El alcalde debería de negarse a colaborar con
The mayor should refuse to collaborate with the federal government in the separation of families and make that clear to Tom Homan.
Mayor Adams has said he'll cooperate with federal immigration authorities threatening New York's current status as a sanctuary city. A Palestinian-American man who was convicted and imprisoned in 2008 for his work with the charity Holy Land Foundation has been released from federal prison. Mufid Abdelkader, one of the so-called Holy Land Five, was released to a halfway house on Thursday. Abdelkader and his 4 co-defendants, Hassan Elashi, Shukri Abubakar, Mohammed El Mazain, and Abdurrahman Odeh, received sentences up to 65 years under the Bush administration, accused of working for a terrorist organization. The Holy Land Foundation raised millions of dollars for Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, making it a target for pro-Israel groups in the U.S. Their case was widely denounced as political persecution during the height of the so-called War on Terror and shuttered what was once the largest Muslim charity in the U.S. Shukri Abubakar and Hassan Elashi remain behind bars. Police arrested at least 8 protesters at the campus of New York University Thursday as they nonviolently blockaded the university's library to demand NYU divest from companies that profit from Israel's war and occupation of Palestine. Among those arrested were 2 faculty members, history professor Rebecca Carl and American Studies professor Andrew Ross. They're among 6 professors and dozens of students who've been declared persona non grata by campus security officials and barred from entering NYU buildings. And New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy has signed a bill to prevent book bans as Republican lawmakers in many other states are working to ban a record number of books from school library shelves, most of them dealing with gender identity, sexual orientation, and racial justice. At the signing ceremony this week, Governor Murphy was introduced by Martha Hickson, a retired high school librarian from Annandale, New Jersey, who endured verbal abuse from some parents who objected to LGBTQ theme books in the school library.
According to School Library Journal, nearly half of school librarians reported they had quietly removed books themselves to avoid being the target of a challenge. And those are just the librarians who admitted it. I suspect the number is actually much higher. And I know teachers who will no longer include controversial topics or titles in their classrooms for fear of being targeted too. When this self-censorship happens, it's the students who suffer. They lose the voices and stories that explore the real world beyond their own front door. Our own fear censors the material, so book banners don't have to.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Syria, where tens of thousands of people have gathered at the Great Mosque of Damascus for the first Friday prayers since longtime authoritarian President Bashar al-Assad was toppled by opposition fighters.
Hopefully this Friday is the Friday of the greatest joy, a Friday of victory for our
new caretaker prime minister, Mohammed al-Bashir, was among those at the mosque. He'll act as prime minister until March. This comes as the World Food Program is appealing to donors to help it scale up relief operations for the approximately 2.8 million displaced and food insecure Syrians across the country. That includes more than 1.1 million people who were forcibly displaced by fighting since late November. Israel's defense minister has told his troops to prepare to spend the winter holding the demilitarized zone that separates Syria from the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Earlier today, Prime Minister Netanyahu toured the summit of Mount Haramun in the UN-designated buffer zone. Netanyahu said this week the Golan Heights would, quote, forever be an inseparable part of the state of Israel, unquote. On Thursday, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an urgent de-escalation of airstrikes on Syria by Israeli forces and their withdrawal from the UN buffer zone. In Ankara, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Turkey's foreign minister and the president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Blinken said the U.S. and Turkey would do to prevent a resurgence of the Islamic State group in Syria. Meanwhile, Erdogan told Blinken that Turkey reserves the right to strike the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces led by the Kurdish People's Protection Units, or YPG, which Turkey considers terrorist. For more, we go to Damascus for the first time since the fall of longtime authoritarian President Bashar al-Assad, where we're joined by the Associated Press investigative reporter, Sarah El-Deeb, who's based in the Middle East, a region she's covered for 2 decades. Sarah, welcome to Democracy Now! You are overlooking the square where tens of thousands of Syrians have gathered for the first Friday prayers since the fall of Assad. Describe the scene for us.
There's a lot of firsts here. It's the first time they gather on Friday after Bashar al-Assad fled the country. It's the first time everyone seems to be very happy. I think that's the dominant sentiment, especially people who are in the square. There's ecstasy, tens of thousands of people. They're still chanting down with Bashar al-Assad, but what's new is that it's also visible that the sentiment is they've been so far happy with the new rulers, not there is no criticism, loud criticism of the new rulers yet. So I'd say the dominant thing is that everyone's happy down there.
Sarah El-Deeb, you recently wrote an AP article headlined, "Thousands Scour Syria's Most Horrific Prison but Find No Sign of Their Loved Ones." On Tuesdays, families of disappeared prisoners continued searching Sednaya prison for signs of their long-lost loved ones who were locked up under Assad's brutal regime.
I will show you the photo of my missing brother. It's been 14 years. This is his photo. I don't know what he looks like if I find him. I don't know what he looks like because I am seeing the photos of prisoners getting out. They are like skeletons. But this is his photo. If anyone has seen him, can know anything about him, or can help us, he is one of thousands of prisoners who are missing. I am asking for everyone, not only my brother, uncle, cousin, and relatives.
Talk about this mad search by Syrians across the country.
This is the other scene that's been dominating our coverage and our reporting since we arrived here. The contrast between the sense of relief over the departure of Bashar al-Assad, but then the sadness and the concern and the no answers for where the loved ones have gone. Thousands, also tens of thousands of people have marched on Sednaya. It's the counter to this scene where people were looking for any sign of where their relatives have been. As you know really well, so many people have reported their relatives missing, tens of thousands, since the beginning of the revolt, but also before. I mean, I think this is part of the feature of this government is that there has been a lot of security crackdown. People were scared to speak, but because there was a good reason for it. They were picked up at any expression of discontent or expression of opinion. So where we were in Sednaya 2-3 days ago, it feels like one big day, I have to say. Where we were in Sednaya, people were also describing what anything from the smallest expression of opinion, a violation of a traffic light, no answers, and they still don't know where their loved ones are. I mean, I think we know quite a lot from research before arriving here about the notorious prison system in Syria. There's secret prisons, there are security branches where people were being held. I think this is the first time we have an opportunity to go look at those facilities. What was surprising and shocking to the people, and also to a lot of us journalists, was that we couldn't find any sign of these people. I think, and the answers are, we're still looking for them, but what was clear is that only a handful, I mean not a handful, hundreds of people were found. Many of them were also found in morgues. There were apparent killing at the last hours of before the regime departed. One of them was the prominent activist, Mazen al-Hamada, that we were at his funeral yesterday. He was found, and his family believes that he was found killed, and his family believes his body was fresh. He was killed only a few days earlier. So I think the killing continued up until the last hour.
I was wondering if you can tell us more about Mazen. I mean, I wanted to play a clip of Mazen's nephew, Yahya al-Hussein.
In 2020, he was taken from the Netherlands to Germany through the Syrian embassy there. And from there, they brought him to Syria with a fake passport. He arrived at the airport at around 2:30 a.m. and called my aunt to tell her that he arrived at the airport and asked for money. When they reached out to him the next day, they were told that Air Intelligence had arrested him.
That's Mazen's nephew, Yahya al-Hussein. Sarah, if you can explain, this was an activist who left Syria after he had been imprisoned and tortured, more than a decade ago, but ultimately came back, apparently according to assurances that he would not be retaken, and now his body found.
I mean, I think it's like you were saying, it's very hard to explain. This is someone who was very outspoken and was working on documenting the torture and the killing and the secret prisons in Syria. So he was very well aware of his role and his position vis-a-vis the government. Yet he felt it was hard to explain what Mazen's decision was based on, but his family believes he was lured into Syria by some false promises of security and safety. I mean, his heart was in Syria. He left Syria. It never left him. He was working from wherever he was. He was in the Netherlands. He was in the U.S. I think to expose these crimes, and I think these are the words of his family. He was a witness on the crimes of the Assad government, and he was a martyr of the Assad government. One of the people that were at the funeral yesterday was telling us Mazen was a lesson. The Assad government was teaching all detainees a lesson through Mazen to keep him silent. I think it was just a testimony to how cruel this ruling system has been for the past 50 years. People would go back to his father's rule also, but I think with the revolution, with the protest in 2011, all these crimes and all these detentions were just en masse. I think the estimates are for anywhere between 150,000 and 80,000 detainees that no one can account for. That is on top of also all the people that were killed in airstrikes and in opposition areas in crackdown on protest. So it was surprising that at the last minute, it was surprising and yet not very surprising. When I asked the family why did they do that, they would look at me and like, why are you asking this question? They do that, that's what they did. It was just difficult to understand how even at the last minute, and even for someone that they promised security, this would be the end. Initiated and tortured and killed, unfortunately.
Sarah, you spoke in Damascus to a U.S. citizen, Travis Timmerman, who says he was imprisoned in Syria. This is a clip from an interview with Al Arabiya Thursday, in which he says he spent the last 7 months in a prison cell in Damascus.
My name is Travis.
Travis.
Yes.
So, إذا وصلنا إلى شخص يدعى Travis Timmerman.
That's right.
That's right.
But just Travis. Just call me Travis.
Call you Travis. Okay.
Travis.
Where were you all this time?
I was imprisoned in Damascus for the last 7 months. I was in prison in a cell by myself, and in the early morning of this Monday, or the Monday of this week, they took a hammer and they broke my door down. Well, the armed men just wanted to get me out of my cell, and then really the man who I stuck with was a Syrian man named Yili, who was also a prisoner that was just free. And he took me by the side, by the arm really, and he and a young woman that lives in Damascus, and us three exited the prison together.
Sarah Deeb, your AP report on Timmerman is headlined American Pilgrim imprisoned in Assad, Syria, calls his release from prison a blessing. What can you share about him after interviewing him?
I spent quite a bit of time with Travis last night and I think his experience was very different from what I was just describing. He was detained for crossing illegally into Syria, and I think his description of his experience was it was okay. He was not mistreated. He was fed well. I mean, especially when I compare it to what I heard from the Syrian prisoners in the secret prisons or in detention facilities. He would receive rice, potatoes, tomatoes. None of this was available to the Syrian detainees. He would go to the bathroom 3 times a day, although this was uncomfortable for him because, of course, it was not whenever he wanted. But it was not something that other Syrian detainees would experience. His experience also was that he heard a lot of beating and a lot of beating. I think that's what he described it as, beating from nearby cells. They were mostly Syrian detainees. For him, that was an implicit threat of the use of violence against him, but he did not get any, he was not beaten or tortured.
And Sarah, if you could also talk about Austin Tice, the American freelance journalist. His family, his mother and father and brothers and sisters seem to be repeatedly saying now that they believe he's alive, held by the Syrian government, and they're desperately looking for him or reaching out to people in Syria. What do you know?
What we know is that people thought Travis was Tice when they first saw him. They found him in a house in a village outside of Damascus, and I think that's what triggered. We didn't know that Travis was in a Syrian prison, so I think that's where everyone was going to check. They thought that this was Tice. I think the search, the U.S. administration, the family, they're all looking and determined to look for Tice. The family believes that he was in Syrian government prison. He entered Syria 2012. He was a journalist, but I think his family seemed to think that he's still in the Syrian government prison, but I think so far we have not had any sign of Tice from all those released. But mind you, the scenes of release from prisons was chaotic, from multiple prisons at the same time, and we're still day by day finding out about new releases and people who were set free on that Sunday morning.
Finally, Sarah Deeb, you've reported on the Middle East for decades. You just wrote a piece for AP titled, "These Palestinians Disappeared After Encounters with Israeli Troops in Gaza." So we're pivoting here. So much attention is being paid to the families of Syrian prisoners who they are finally freeing. Want to turn to Gaza. Tell us about the Palestinians searching for their family members who went missing during raids and arrests by Israeli soldiers in the Gaza Strip, and talk about the lack of accountability for these appearances. You begin your piece with Rima Jour's quest to find her missing husband and daughter.
I talked to Rima Jour for a long time. I mean, I think, like you said, this was a pivot, but the themes have been common across the Middle East, sadly. Rima Jour last saw her family in March of 2024. Both her husband and her 5-year-old daughter were injured after an Israeli raid on their house during the chaotic scenes of the Israeli raids on the Shifa hospital. They lived in the neighborhood, so it was chaotic. They entered their home and they were shooting in the air, or they were shooting, and the family ended up wounded. But what was striking was that the Israeli soldiers made the mother leave the kid wounded in her house and forced her to leave to the south. I think this is not only Rima Jour's case. I think this is something we've seen quite a bit in Gaza, but the fact that this was a 5-year-old and the mom couldn't take her with her was quite moving. And I think what in her case, what her case kind of symbolizes is that during these raids and during these detentions at checkpoints, families are separated, and we don't have any way of knowing how the Israeli military is actually documenting these detentions, these raids. How do they account for people who they detain and then they release briefly? The homes that they enter, can we find out what happened in these homes? We have no idea of holding. I think the Israeli court has also tried to get some information from the military, but so far very few cases have been resolved. And we're talking about not only 500 or 600 people, we're talking about tens of thousands who have been separated, their homes raided during what is now 15 months of war in Gaza.
Sarah Lee, we want to thank you for being with us. Associated Press investigative reporter based in the Middle East for 2 decades, now reporting from Damascus. Next up, today is the 75th day of a hunger strike by Layla Swaif. She's the mother of prominent British Egyptian political prisoner Alaa Abdel Fattah. She's calling on British officials to pressure Egypt for the release of her son. We'll speak to the Cairo University mathematics professor in London, where she's been standing outside the Foreign Office. Back in 20 seconds.
With the conviction of the woman you made me, I find blades of grass from the island you led me. I find on every floor in every drawer.
The moon seems to have gone behind the top of the forest, the tree line, into the clouds there.
Solitary Daughter by Bedouin. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. 75 days ago, Layla Swaif, the British Egyptian
Matrix math.
of the prominent British
People
Egyptian
need to do
political
drills
prisoner,
on Matrix
Alaa
math.
Abdel Fattah, stopped eating.
Better to count
Layla
numbers.
Swaif is a mathematics professor at Cairo
Oh,
University.
shit.
She began her hunger
Mathematics
strike as part of
professor.
a campaign demanding the British government pressure Egypt
Wow.
for the release of her son Alaa. He was due to be released from prison September 29th after 5 years behind bars over unfounded charges of spreading false news. He was rearrested in 2019, just 6 months after he was conditionally released from prison, where he served another lengthy sentence over his activism in Egypt's 2011 uprising. Egyptian authorities have refused to count more than 2 years Alaa spent in pretrial detention toward time served, meaning Alaa now won't be released until 2027. Alaa has spent most of the last decade behind bars, separated from his family. His agonizing and seemingly indefinite imprisonment is part of a wider crackdown on human rights, press freedom, and dissent by the regime of the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Layla Swaif has stepped up her peaceful action, now vowing to stand outside the British Foreign Office in London for at least an hour a day until Alaa is free. She receives an update on his condition or until she collapses. She'll join us in a minute. First, this is Alaa Abdel Fattah, speaking in his own words when Democracy Now! First interviewed him in February 2011 during our special coverage of the Egyptian uprising. And I've just been told that we do have someone on the phone right now, so we're going to go right to that person. Can you tell us who you are and where you are?
This is Alaa Abdel Fattah. I'm an activist in this revolution. I'm standing in front of the TV building in Cairo.
Okay, tell us, Alaa. It's great to have you with us, a prominent Egyptian blogger, democracy activist. What is happening in front of the presidential palace, one of a number of new places that are being occupied by protesters, like Egyptian state TV as well, and the parliament?
In front of the TV building, it's a big crowd. We can't shut down the TV building because of its shape, and it's heavily barricaded by the army. And what we're trying to do is put pressure on the employees working inside to join us, to revolt and refuse to spread free propaganda.
Alaa Abdel Fattah has faced horrific conditions in prison. At the Tora prison complex in 2019, Egyptian police subjected him to beatings and torture. He's since been transferred, but Amnesty International found prison authorities have denied him access to fresh air and sunlight for the past 5 years and continue to deny him access to his lawyer and consular visits with British officials. For more, we go to London, where we're joined by Layla Suwaif. She is Alaa's mother. She's 68 years old. Today is the 75th day of her hunger strike. Professor, thanks so much for being with us. Layla Suwaif, we spent time in your home after the UN Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh 2 years ago, where you were demanding your son's freedom. He became a main theme as a political prisoner of the UN Climate Summit in Egypt. But here you are in Britain as a British Egyptian citizen. Tell us what you are demanding and tell us how you are feeling right now. 75 days without food?
Hello. Before I speak about me and Alaa, I want to say something inspired by what I heard on your program just before I came on about Syrians who had disappeared and Palestinians who had disappeared. In Egypt, too, we have enforced disappearances. Nothing, of course, on the same scale as Syria, but certainly hundreds, maybe even a lot more. Enforced disappearances are becoming more and more something that dictators around our area at least use as a way of intimidating people and families. This has to stop. This has to be taken seriously by already Western powers turn a blind eye on most of the human rights abuses that their allied regimes practice. Can they at least not turn a blind eye on enforced disappearances? Thank you. Now, to get back to Alaa and me and how I'm feeling. First, let me correct you, I'm 68. And yes, I have been 75 days on hunger strike. At the moment, I'm still not feeling any serious consequences of my hunger strike. Mainly, I suppose, because I'm still in the period where the body, particularly if you're taking salts with water, the body burns excess fats. It would seem that we have not gone into the phase where the body starts burning muscle and you start having serious consequences. I have been on. I'm hoping that my hunger strike will create a crisis for both governments. Actually, I'm pressuring both governments. I'm binational. So, and Alaa is binational, so I consider that both governments are responsible for him, particularly since they're friendly and allied governments. I'm hoping, since neither government appears to do anything about political prisoners except when there is a crisis, I'm hoping to create a crisis. I'm hoping I've already created a crisis. That's what I'm doing, and that's how I'm feeling.
Layla, in late November, the British Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, shared photos on social media of his meeting with you. He wrote, quote, "Today I met with Alaa Abdel Fattah's family. They've campaigned tirelessly for his release. I'm focused on securing consular access and his release as quickly as possible. The UK will continue to raise this with the highest levels of the Egyptian government." And this is a clip of the British Foreign Minister recently addressing the Parliament.
It's of huge concern, and I pressed him to do more. We have
continue to do that with the Egyptians. It's obviously sensitive because of the situation in Gaza, but I don't think they're under any doubt how seriously this is taken by the British system, the government, and this parliament.
So, that's the British Foreign Minister, David Lammy. Can you explain what kind of pressure Britain can exert on Egypt to release Allah? Are there negotiations taking place? He has said London's relationship with Cairo is important as he has faced questions about possible economic threats and efforts to free Allah. Also, the British government has repeatedly raised his name at the highest levels, but that clearly hasn't been enough. Is it true you learned that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer did not raise Allah's case when he met with the Egyptian President Sisi on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Brazil? And explain exactly what the terms are that you are demanding right now.
Right. Let's begin with the last question. First, no, Mr. Keir Starmer did not raise Allah's case during the G20 summit. That's finally been answered. I mean, an MP demanded tabled the question about that more than 10 days ago, and he finally got the answer like 2 days ago or something, or 3 days ago. So that's Mr. Keir Starmer did raise the question in August in a phone call with Mr. Sisi, but the difference between August and after 29 September is that on 29 September, Allah finished his sentence. He had been sentenced to 5 years. However unfair that sentence was, however tainted that sentence was, and he was not released. So this should have put matters on a completely different level. That's to your last question. To go back to Mr. Lamy, yes, it is true that he met with us. It is true that he has been making the presentations. It is true, but our experience is that the previous government has been making representations to the higher Egyptian authorities for years. And my take on this is that when you make representations to the highest authorities and nothing happens, then the message getting through is to me and to the Egyptian authorities is that this is just lip service, that they don't really have to do anything about it. If you make representations to the highest authorities and nothing happens, you have to do something else afterwards. You can't keep making representations to the highest authorities and then not doing anything about it. What Britain can do, well, Mr. David Lammy, when he was shadow minister, did outline in Parliament what Britain could do. I suggest, again, as I have suggested before, and as I suggested to him during our meeting, that he should go back to his own words when he was shadow minister and try and put some of these measures through.
I want to go back to your son, to Ala Abdel Fattah, in his own words. We spoke to him in Cairo a decade ago, in 2014, when he'd been released on bail after nearly 4 months in prison.
Yeah, I mean, there's been activists in Alexandria have been sentenced for 5 years, I think, no, 2 years. 2 years, and the verdict was confirmed in the appeals process. There's been several student groups that have been sentenced anything from 1 year to 5. These have been common. There's also a couple of cases where students have been sentenced with crazy, like 14 years and 17 years and 11 years and so on. So they're on a sentencing frenzy. I mean, this is not just about me, and it's almost as if it's a war on a whole generation.
Ala Abdel Fattah in 2014, interviewed by our own Sharif Abdel Qaddous, who was in Cairo at the time. Layla, your final words to the planet, and also if by any chance Allah can hear you.
I want to see Allah reunited with his son in Brighton. Khalid is autistic. He's finally settled in a very good special needs school in Brighton. Khalid is 13 this year. Allah has missed all of his childhood. They need to be together. And until that happens, I'm not going to go back on my word. I'm on hunger strike until either I collapse or that happens. I know that this is hard on all my children, particularly Ala, but they have a life to lead after this, and I hope I will be there for that life. I don't particularly want to leave them with the memory of a martyred mother, but if that's what it takes, I want Ala reunited with Khalid in Brighton. And these are my words also to the British and the Egyptian authorities. If you want, a sort of shadow haunting all your relations, right, go on as you're doing now. The Egyptians being stubborn and the British being hesitant, and that's what you get. Thank you.
Let's wait. Thank you so much for joining us. Mother of the jailed Egyptian-British author, activist, blogger, Ala Abdel Fattah. She is on the 75th day of a hunger strike, a fast, calling for the UK government to push for Allah's release. He's been imprisoned in Egypt despite having completed his sentence in September. Layla Swaif is a mathematics professor at Cairo University. Stay with us. Passed away in February. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at another potential political prisoner, this time here in the United States. Omali Yeshitela, the longtime chair of the African People's Socialist Party, leader of the Uhuru movement. In September, a federal jury in Florida found him and 3 others guilty of conspiring with an agent of the Russian government to, quote, sow discord and interfere in U.S. elections. But the jury acquitted the 4 on the most serious charge of acting as agents of a foreign government. Prosecutors accused them of working on behalf of Russia in a multi-year foreign malign influence campaign here. Omali Yeshitela and his co-defendants, Penny Hess and Jesse Neville, have become known as the Uhuru 3. They'll be sentenced next Monday, face up to 5 years in prison. A 4th person, Ghazi Kodzo of the Black Hammer Party, has already been sentenced to 5 years probation. Yeshitela's lawyers had argued the government was targeting the African People's Socialist Party over its longtime criticism of U.S. policy at home and abroad. Omali Yeshitela is 83 years old. He joined me this week from Tampa ahead of Monday's sentencing. I asked him his response to the verdict and what he was charged with and acquitted of.
We were charged, as you mentioned earlier, with being Russian agents, and something that they determined, that is the United States government, that began in 2014, or on or about 2014, and extended up until July 29, 2022, according to them. So after 50 years or so, more, 60 years in my instance of working for the liberation of African people, the U.S. government determined that since 2014 I became an employee, an agent under the direction and control of a foreign government, namely Russia. And then they charged me also, the three of us, Penny Hess, Jesse Neville, and I, with being, with conspiracy to work for a foreign government without registering with the Department of Justice, which was an extraordinary charge. And so after a week-long trial or so, the jury examined things that came from more than 2.5 million books and equivalency, 13 terabytes of information that they stole from our devices. A jury determined that we were not Russian agents, and which meant, of course, that they agreed that the only thing we'd ever done is work for the liberation of African people, on the one hand. On the other hand, they convicted us of conspiracy to do something that never happened. And the Russian agent charge carried with it a 10-year prison sentence, and the conspiracy charge carries us, the conviction carries the possibility of a 5-year prison sentence and $250,000 fine. So on December 16th, we'll be going to Tampa, Florida, and we want everybody to come with us to face sentencing for, as they said, conspiring to do something that never happened.
You've long been known as an anti-war activist from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. In this case, they said that your activism against the U.S. being involved with Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine was working on behalf of Russia. Can you respond?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous assumption. The fact is, our party has, against every notorious war that the United States government has been involved in, we concluded a long time ago the inability of the United States to engage in a just war. And we were opposed to what they were doing in Vietnam. The United States did in Vietnam. We were opposed to the aggression against Cuba, the aggression against peoples all around the world. And this notion that somehow the Russians had to tell us to be opposed to what's happening in Ukraine is ridiculous for a number of reasons. And one of them being that, generally speaking, the Black liberation movement in this country has historically been opposed to those wars. And that's been a strategic problem for the United States, that even Foreign Affairs, one of the journals of the leading thinking representatives of the ruling class of this country, has complained about affecting in a negative way U.S. foreign policy because black people have always been opposed to these wars, and that was true of us too. So the notion that somehow the Russians had to teach us to do this is ridiculous. And I also think it's important to say that we believe in free speech in a very serious way. That this was an assault on freedom of speech, the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, and that black people in this country have been in the vanguard of the struggle for the Bill of Rights, for free speech, and that's been absolutely necessary, because when the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, was ratified by the United States Congress in 1791, black people were property. We had no rights to speak or do anything like that, so who else would fight harder for the right to free speech, the right for freedom of assembly, the Bill of Rights, than black people? And we've been in the vanguard, and so there's nothing that is new about that. And this assault that they're making on the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, is actually an assault on African people, our agency, our right to have freedom of thought, to convict us of thinking something, and what they say we think is up to their interpretation. So we didn't do anything, and that was the foundational charge. The jury said they didn't work for Russia, but they conspired to do something that never happened. So it's a thought crime that they have convicted us for, and we have fought it all along, and we continue to fight that.
So talk about your years of activism. When we last spoke, you said you have attended other international conferences, for example, in Spain, where your expenses were paid by a Spanish NGO. And explain the comparison you made with going to a conference in Russia, and talk about the issues you've raised.
Well, in the indictment, or certainly the press release around the indictment, the United States government declared that we took this expense-paid trip to Moscow. And they made it sound as if somehow there was some lavish occurrence that was paid for by Moscow. When the truth is, it was simple that they paid for our travel to go to Moscow. They paid for housing while we were in Moscow. And when I say they, I'm talking about a non-governmental organization in Moscow, paid for that and to attend conferences, international conferences, one of which had to do with a situation of nations of people who were struggling for liberation, for self-determination. And that was in 2015. I took 2 trips to Moscow. And then, they overlooked the fact that I went to Spain in 2017, a non-governmental organization. They paid our transportation. They paid for 3 of us to come. They paid a hefty honorarium for my being there. And it was an international conference with people from all around the world. It had participation from former members of the United Nations and from the Spanish government itself. But that didn't matter. They wanted to take this Moscow thing and act like it was something peculiar. I've traveled to more than 15, 16, 19 different countries, if I'm not mistaken, throughout the world, and as well as to Big Mountain, where the Diné or Navajo people were under assault. And I've done this partially because it's my responsibility to do it, to end the isolation that had occurred of our movement. We were attacked in the 1960s and we were alone, the African Liberation Movement. We were isolated, and I wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. I wanted to win as many people around the world to recognize what our struggle is all about and to have friends for our movement. And so that's part of what this was about. Another aspect of it was showing solidarity to other peoples who were oppressed, the indigenous people. And even as we have this discussion now, it happens with recognition that Leonard Peltier, an indigenous man, has been locked up for nearly 50 years for trying to defend the indigenous people. He's a political prisoner. So we've been doing this kind of work, and the U.S. government very selectively determined that the trip to Moscow, the connection to a Russian non-governmental organization represented working under the direction and control of a foreign government without notifying the United States government, Department of Justice, that I was doing Attorney General, that I was working for a foreign agent, which is a ridiculous claim.
Molly, talk about how the African People's Socialist Organization got started, how the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, got started.
Well, yeah, the Uhuru movement and the African People's Socialist Party, we stem from the whole struggle for civil rights in the United States. I myself had been active working for voter education and registration in the 1960s. I traveled throughout the state of Florida doing that. And I joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And SNCC was that bridge between the anti-racist movement for integration and the Black Power anti-colonial movement. And SNCC introduced the whole issue of Black Power to the world. And I was a member of SNCC. And SNCC came under vicious assault, partially because of the Black Power demand. And people were jailed, were arrested, came under attack, and what have you. You may remember at the time Stokely Carmichael, as he was known, married Miriam Makeba, who was an extraordinary, internationally known artist.
Miriam Makeba, the great South African singer. That's Omali Yeshitela, the chair of the African People's Socialist Party and leader of the Uhuru movement. He's 83 years old. He's due to be sentenced on Monday after a Florida jury found him and his co-defendants, Penny Hess and Jesse Neville, known as the Uhuru Three, guilty of conspiring to act as Russian agents, but cleared them of actually doing so.
Star Trek.
For our show, I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Ukraine has Nazis, and USA is supporting them while they support Zionists in Israel. And those Zionists are not Semitic.
On Friday, December 20th at the
Zionists are not Semitic? I don't know if I was able to share that to Instagram. They may have... yeah, I am able to share it. See, there we go. United States has a problem. Paperclip Nazis, National Socialist, white supremacy. And I'm really worried that United States may have entered the age of Biff. If you watched the movie Back to the Future, you may understand what I'm talking about. Donald Trump, is he going to do good for humanity? Or is he going to do more of the same? Just be the same two wings of the same bird, two hands of the same body, left versus right? It's the same body then, right? People had a debate about whether some children were left-handed or right-handed. That debate shouldn't have happened regardless. There were some people in the 70s that were taking bets on youth for them to mortis, die, and what time they would die, and that shouldn't have happened. There are people that are trying to keep us, people in my age group, mid-40s to maybe mid-70s, in a kind of Squid Game for our whole life until we end. This started somewhere in the 70s. English and French were not the official language of any of that country called Canada, or many places west of the Mississippi before I was born. A wool has been pulled over people's eyes with the Christian calendar. It's not 2024 years since the one they call Christ was born. While the United States sponsors Nazis in Ukraine and Zionists in the Levant that cannot prove they are Semitic, that are murdering Semites, police officers in the United States of America that shouldn't even be police officers murder indigenous Americans. Canada has a slight problem that mixed indigenous Americans get killed by police officers sometimes, RCMP. Sometimes it's due to mental illness. There's a big mental illness problem worldwide. The cure is not more petroleum-based, opium-based, man-made drugs. The cure is proper diet and proper herbs and spice for people's blood types and genetics. Gen dive or gen diverse means genetic or genealogical diversity, which makes up each person. Their mother, their father, the genes that come to them from their ancestors. Every child goes through a transformation for their gender at a certain age. Some people were trying to force us to be transvestite because of an agenda to wipe out, erase our culture. Some people have greenwashed, green economy, and what is e-vehicles, ethanol-filled vehicles, combustion, clean burning, carbon dioxide fuels trees. Greenwash that to making a cash flow, a revenue stream a financial gain system from the greenback dollar. I just found out recently the greenback dollar was first printed in Quebec. 1826 was the year? Is that year even the right year? If people in Eastern Europe say the Roman Catholic Church added 200 to 300 years, maybe even 500 years to the Anno Domini's calendar, what year really is it? Well, the deep state sponsors Nazis 10 years ago. While the deep state sponsors Nazis in the Ukraine, and Biden laughs because he blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, they also sponsor Zionists, which can't prove they're Semitic, in the Levant, which got away with murder around the world before 1972 Common Era. No one can prove when World War II ended. I'd say it's 1972 Common Era. What do I know? I'm only 56. Sorry about the commercials for some error. YouTube should have been commercial free for the community, for communication, not for someone to make a financial revenue stream and gain. The sound, phonetic sound pattern, money, in Greek, meant education. Monastery, short form for monastery. So it's a place to get educated. It doesn't mean revenue stream and financial gain.
Flash. In place of the defiant speeches, the somber strains of Beethoven now ring out over Independence Square. This revolution is moving into a new phase. But amidst the flowers and the children's tributes, flashes of something more sinister. Groups of armed men strut through the square with dubious iconography. That yellow armband is a false angle, a German symbol used by several SS divisions during the Second World War. Far-right graffiti is appearing, daubed on the walls of the city. The people who brought down the government were overwhelmingly ordinary Ukrainians, students and doctors, workers and even families, people who simply refused to back down. But the most organised and perhaps the most effective were a small number of far-right groups. When it came to confrontations with the police, it was often the nationalists who were the loudest and the most violent. A group calling itself the Right Sector is perhaps the largest. Its members can be seen marching around Kiev in columns of about a dozen. Mostly they carry baseball bats. Sometimes they carry guns. We met these men posing for pictures outside the burnt-out remains of what was once their headquarters. I asked them about their political beliefs.
Национал-социалистская тематика иногда в некоторых людях она есть проступает, как бы, ну, чтобы была единая нация. Но не у всех, это не заложено в основе этой организации, это у некоторых людей есть.
А у вас?
У меня лично есть.
В смысле, объясните?
Ну, мне как бы нравится эта идея единой нации. Я хочу, чтобы нация была единая, чтобы один народ, одна страна, одна нация.
А это подразумевается что? Что?
Ну, как бы, чтобы чистая нация. Ну, не то, что там, как бы у Гитлера как было, но в своем роде немножко, ну, маленько, но было, чтобы своя нация.
What about the East, I asked? What about Crimea, where many Ukrainians feel close historical ties to Russia?
Кому нравится Россия, пусть едут в Россию. Украина только для украинцев.
Police have largely disappeared from the streets of Kiev. Law and order is maintained by so-called self-defense groups. Not all hold extreme views, but those who do are often shy of the cameras. We got a late-night phone call from another group known as C14, inviting us to meet their leader at their new base. It turned out to be the former headquarters of the Communist Party, now occupied by the far right.
It's our general mission to totally ruin chains that connect our country with imperial power from the past.
And that being Russia.
Yes, we can tell Russia, not only Russia, Soviet Union.
Are you a Nazi?
No, I don't think I'm a Nazi, I'm a Ukrainian nationalist. And
what does that mean?
The main confrontation is about that some ethnic groups have control many business structures, some economic, some political forces, and
which ethnic groups?
Russians and Jews and Poles. It may be some non-Ukrainian group control a huge percent of some economic or political power. And of course, in this situation, Ukrainian people have some tension between it, and it causes conflicts.
Mr. Karas says his group consists of around 200 men. C14 is affiliated with a political party called Svoboda, or Freedom, which now controls 4 ministries in the new government, including the Ministry of Defense. 2 of its MPs were recently photographed brandishing well-known far-right numerology. 88 stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet, HH, Heil Hitler.
We, as Svoboda, in no way espouse Nazism. In fact, we fight against Nazism. For us, Nazism and communism are two sides of the same coin. Those are both totalitarian ideologies which destroyed the Ukrainian nation in the 20th century and fought against Ukrainians and killed millions of Ukrainians.
The fervor of the revolution is beginning to fade now. People are starting to move on. But it's clear that it was the radical groups who kept up the pressure on Viktor Yanukovych, and many of them feel that this really is their victory. The question is, how much power will that give the far right in the new Ukraine? Ukrainian politics is in a state of flux. Different groups are jostling for position. Left-wing activists have also taken control of some government buildings, but it's the right that appears to be coming out on top.
When the fighting started, they started to attract more and more young people, and then not only young people, but all kinds of persons, where they were marginal, regarded as marginal. Previously, now they are seen as being at the core of the protest, and therefore at the core of those who now have a popular legitimacy to make decisions.
With their anti-Russian rhetoric, events in Crimea will almost certainly play into the hands of the nationalists. No one knows exactly how strong they are in terms of numbers, but the influence of the far right in Ukraine is growing.
Did you hear that crowd? Lite has been nominated for 2 Golden Globes, including Best Supporting Male Actor Denzel Washington. I must have power. It's ferociously entertaining and demands to be seen on the big screen.
Strike the ball!
Well, let's see if I have any points to talk on as I am here. I got a song to sing. Layla, I got you on my knees, Layla. Begging, darling, please, Layla. I'm down on my knees, Layla. It's a song. I know that song. I don't think I have any comment. Yeah, freaking. The world is awkward. The news media is controlled by the Cabal. And They might arrest me and put me in prison forever just because I keep on talking about them since the 90s. But then again, it seems like they've censored our family. Like, instead of doing the good censor, the Holy Church censor. Let's see if I could spell that word correctly today. I'm not the best speller any day, all the days of the week. But let's see if I could spell it well today the first time. That's why I was supposed to have some help for all that I'm doing. I guess I got the word spelled wrong there. First time. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Instead of us having more censor, this kind of censor, right? Conan meets his censor.
Skyscanners are beautiful. So just millions of prices,
You gotta watch commercials today with me on Rumble here. Here's Skyscanner.
That one place was pretty bad.
Oh, sheesh.
Hi, I'm sitting here at TBS headquarters with Jim Spann. Is that right?
That's correct.
Jim, tell us what your title is.
I am a manager of original productions for Standards and Practices.
I worked in network for many years, as you may be aware. 20-some odd
Consumers, some of them have figured out that the country's a scam. They invent mental health ailments they don't have. They take days off on end. They terrify their...
Instead of them helping my uncle and grandfather of this, censor, 13th century copper cast, fretted and engraved.
The censors are recipients to burn incense.
Hey, how you doing? Sorry, how's we're still recording the video here.
At the start of the Romanesque
oh, so I guess you're talking about later in the day,
enthusiastic
not
tradition of burning
at this
incense in
time of the day.
liturgical services gained in importance, and highly
Okay.
elaborate censers were made.
Oh, I'm in the center of the island by the United Church. It's
the incense in.
yeah, no, not
These
Port
forms of
Perry,
sumptuary
Scugog Island, on the
manufacture
island itself.
generally fell into two groups. One completely spherical,
Okay, about how
and
many? I
another
guess a
with
few
a
hours then, I
traditional
guess,
circular pot
like midday.
with a lid in the form of a tower. Both continuing with a system of
Oh,
chains.
so you are on
coming
this way.
together in a fastener at the top, like a large articulated
Oh, okay,
ring.
I'm at 19100.
Within a broad time frame from the 12th
I will
century
get dressed
until the end of the 13th, the Museo Episcopal de
Okay, cool. All right,
possesses
take
an important collection of over 30 copper or bronze pieces, cast or sheet, decorated by engraving, chiseling, enameling and gilding. Some show formal relationships with the manufacturing patterns of the Rhine and the Meuse, and others with the products of Limoges in Aquitaine.
Looking for a quick and strong lighter?
Yeah, so as far as my recollection goes, my grandfather and my uncle and them, they needed help to convey a message about that censer, which in the Latin language, I believe it's called that, a censer burner. Now, I used to use that at the Catholic Church on on high holy days with the holy incense burnt in the incense burner called a censer. The ting, 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 walk around, do the 3 vows, and bless the whole place. Now, a lot of us altar boys and people that have served in different churches, Christian churches, and other different Coptic churches and that, say the smell of that holy thing is the same or similar to cannabis. Have a great day. I'm on the island that used to have bats. Bye-bye.